So here's the setting, the federal budget, for the budget talk, the federal budget. We want to look at government spending, taxes, budget deficits, and federal debt. And now here's a very interesting graph. This gives government spending and federal government revenues as a percent of GDP. What do you notice about revenues? This is from 1974 till 2034 predicted. What do you notice about revenues as a percent of GDP? They're roughly constant, around 18%. And by the way, this is what the CBO had. In another article years ago, I didn't have these later data, but I had the earlier data. This was about 18% from about 1953 on, once we got out of the Korea War. And it's amazingly constant. But what do you notice about outlays, government spending as a percent of GDP? It shot up during the financial crisis and then shot way up during COVID with all the subsidies and so on that the government spent. To now where in 2034, the Congressional Budget Office expects that outlays will be close to 25% of GDP and revenues will be 18%, which leaves a deficit of almost 7% of GDP. So GDP now is close to 30 trillion, so 7% is around 2 trillion. That gap is slightly lower right now, so it's around, I don't know, 1.8 trillion, something like that. That's a big number. Here are spending categories. Net interest, discretionary, and mandatory. Let me explain those. Net interest is obvious. It's the interest that the government is paying on the debt. And notice in 2035, it's expected to be 4.1%. Now it's about 3% of GDP, so it's around 900 billion. Discretionary, that's things like spending on defense, spending on roads, various other things that the government chooses to spend. Mandatory, I've never liked that term, but here's what it means, and then I'll explain why I don't think it's a good term. It means that these are kind of locked in if Congress does nothing. And it has to do with Social Security, Medicare, things like that. If they don't do anything, it just goes up year by year. They call it mandatory, which I think is their way of avoiding responsibility. Because it's not mandatory. They could change those rules tomorrow. They won't, but they could. Now, the other term people often use for that is entitlements. Well, I don't think entitlements is good either. You probably know by now I'm a pretty libertarian person. I don't think we're entitled to that, but that's the other term people use. Okay. Now here's the one I wanted to get to. Federal debt as a percent of GDP. Notice it went over 100% during World War II, which makes sense. Just to give you an idea, in World War II, the peak spending year was 1944, and the federal government spent just on defense 40% of GDP. Now we spend under 4%, really closer to 3%. And of course that meant deficits accumulated, but when we got out of the war, they cut government spending substantially as a percent of GDP from around 45, because remember there were other things besides defense, down to about 15. And so that meant debt was falling as a percent of GDP. It reached its trough in 1974. And then during the second Clinton term, you can see it fell again. And that's due to two main people, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich. They didn't like each other, but they bargained and negotiated with each other, and they brought defense spending down as a percent of GDP and didn't have any major new discretionary spending programs, and they somewhat limited Medicare in little ways. So that was that. And now, of course, we're way up there. What are the odds that the President and Congress are going to do much about these major spending programs?
Zero.
Close to zero, very low. And let me give you one little indicator from January that some of you might know about, some of you might have even been affected by it. And by the way, I don't want to get into a long discussion about whether it's justified or not. I think it's not, but anyway, I just want to tell you the facts. The Social Security Fairness Act, it repealed, she wrote it would repeal, but it did happen. President Biden signed it in early January, repealed these two rules, so it gave public sector workers what she regarded, and I regard, as unfairly high benefits by treating them as if they've been low-income workers with limited earnings histories and discounting years of public service that qualify them for receiving generous public pensions at the state and local level. And that one measure will cost over time $196 billion. And I think one reason so many people in Congress voted for it, Congressmen people typically don't know much. They're not that smart. They're not that informed. And they voted for it. It was, hey, it's easy to do. And now let me show you the vote. In the House, 327 to 75. In the Senate, 76 to 20. In short, it was a bipartisan vote in favor. I was writing this part on Friday, and I remembered this quote from Alan Simpson. And I went online to see what he'd said, and he died, it was announced an hour earlier. What are those odds? And it reminded me about Alan Simpson. He had these great lines, and no, it's not the one about politics. I don't know if you've ever heard that one. Alan Simpson once said, politics is from a Latin word, poly meaning many, and ticks meaning blood-sucking insects. But my favorite, that I could not find online, but I saw him saying it, he was leading a bunch of Japanese officials of some sort through the Capitol building, and he was trying to explain in a nutshell federal politics. And he said, we've got two parties, the evil party and the stupid party. The evil party is the Democrats, the stupid party is the Republicans, and I'm a member of the stupid party. And then he says, and every once in a while, we do something both evil and stupid, and we call it bipartisan. I think that applies to this one. Okay. Now, when I was researching this, I found one article yesterday that was really quite striking. The Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, after President Biden signed it, admitted it had nothing to do with inflation reduction. It was a global warming, climate change kind of law to subsidize all kinds of otherwise expensive energy, like solar and so on. And these two people who are energy economists at the Cato Institute costed it out. And by the way, even the lower bound came in way above what the CBO had estimated. And they point out in the article, the way they did it is kind of a black box. We don't know exactly how they did this, but they did it. And so over 10 years, the upper bound on spending is close to $2 trillion. That T is trillion. The lower bound is $1 trillion, $936 billion. Over the years up to 2015, $4.67 trillion, lower bound $2 trillion. And then, well, you should really, as economists, we know when we take future streams of spending or income, we discount them by an interest rate. So the typical ones they use in the federal government are 3 and 7, just to get a range. At a 3% discount rate, the upper bound is over $3 trillion and the lower bound is about $1.5 trillion. And at a 7% interest rate, the upper bound is a little over $2 trillion, the lower bound is a little over $1 trillion. Those are large numbers. To remind you, when this was being voted on, they really needed Joe Manchin's vote. And Larry Summers, who was a colleague of mine when we were both economists at the Council of Economic Advisors, is a very sharp economist. This one, I just think he estimated too quickly, because he went to Manchin and talked Manchin into voting for it. Without that vote, it wouldn't have passed. And he told him, you know, oh, these are going to be relatively low spending numbers, and they weren't. They weren't. And I think if he'd been more careful, he would have seen that. So these are all ways of saying we have these huge spending things in our future. And by the way, remember I gave you the CBO numbers, well the CBO uses its own methodology. So if these two authors are right, spending is going to be higher than that, than their numbers. So that deficit's going to be higher than their estimate. Free trade versus protectionism. So, as you probably know, if you've been paying attention to the press, President Trump has proposed a 25% tariff on goods from Canada and Mexico. I want to say a little about that before I get to China. And when he said that, he said, however, I'll put it on hold for a month if you do these things I want you to do. Have troops at the border to prevent immigrants from coming over, prevent fentanyl from coming over, both Canada and Mexico. And Trudeau said, okay, and he did that. Claudia Sheinbaum, the head of Mexico, said, okay, and she did that as far as I understand. And then he said, well, that's not enough. And so it looks, and by the way, to put in perspective, I did an article on this. The amount of fentanyl coming from Mexico was something like 12,000 pounds. The amount coming from Canada was 46 pounds. The idea that a government can single that out, I mean, it requires this all-knowing, omniscient government, which is not what we have. And by the way, most of the fentanyl that comes into the United States from Mexico comes carried by American citizens and American green card holders. So it's not like the illegal immigrants have their own problems. They'd be crazy to bring fentanyl on top of that. Okay, and now he had a 10% tariff on China, and now he's upped it to 20 on China. To put that in perspective, by the way, as a rough measure, the amount of goods we buy from Canada is roughly equal to the amount we buy from Mexico, and both are slightly greater than the amount we buy from China. And so that just gives you a perspective on what they're taxing. There's very little that economists are unanimous on. In fact, there's nothing, really. But there are, in fact, the old line is, if you laid economists end to end, they'd never come to a conclusion. But that joke is really unjustified when it comes to free trade. Well over 90% of economists in polling data say they favor free trade. And let me kind of tell you a little about why. It's what we call the lesson of comparative advantage. And the lesson of comparative advantage is you produce and sell the item in which you have a comparative advantage. That is the item which you produce at lower cost. And I want to just give some prosaic examples before I give a really neat example. Let's take someone who's a really good lawyer and a really good typist. Well, before Word, okay? If it's Word, you're probably doing it. Someone back in 1980 who's a really good lawyer and a really good typist. And the typist he would hire has half of his words per minute. Should he do his own typing or hire someone to do it? Hire someone. Why?
Opportunity loss.
Yeah. He's giving up too much of the value of what he does. So when I taught this to my students, remember they were U.S. mainly, well, they're military officers, mainly U.S. I would say, were you ever tempted, when you look at someone working under you, one of the enlistees, to just say, the heck with it, I'm going to do it? And a couple of them said, yeah. Most of them said no, they figured that out. But the ones who said yeah said, I never did it again, because it meant I wasn't doing my job. Okay, little trivia question. Who is a better drummer, Ringo Starr or Paul McCartney? You know why I'm asking, right?
Ringo.
Paul McCartney was clearly the better drummer. But if he was drumming, he wasn't doing other things. So they had Ringo as the drummer. Or another one, which I don't have a slide on. What was Babe Ruth's first position in baseball?
Pitcher.
Pitcher. Was he like a so-so pitcher? He was really good. So why not have him be a pitcher.
Better.
Yeah, he couldn't play every game if he was a pitcher. I first started paying attention to Trump's views on trade during the 1993 debate on NAFTA. And he gave a talk in the Central Valley of California in which he was critical of NAFTA. And by the way, I had the clipping from the Monterey Herald. It was an Associated Press story. But as I mentioned, I had this big fire in 2007, so I no longer have it. So I'm just going from memory here. But here's what I remember him saying. Mexican businessmen think they're going to do better under NAFTA. Well, if they think that, we must be doing worse. In other words, he didn't understand the basics of gains from trade. When people trade, they're both better off, not one side. And now, and of course, once he declared to be the Republican nominee in 2015, I started following him more closely. And he gave a talk in Las Vegas that I watched streamed. And you can't find it anymore, but I wrote it all down, word for word. I just kept going back and making sure I got it word for word. And here's one of the things he said in his talk. The biggest boats I've ever seen, I just left Los Angeles, thousands of cars, millions of cars coming in from Japan. We get nothing, we get cars. They get, we want to send rice, we want to send corn. The imbalance of these things. They send a car, we send corn. And he says corn derisively. Me. I wasn't there. Yes, and what's wrong with trading corn for cars? He says later they won't even take our products. So which is it? We do send corn or we don't send corn? This is about comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is in corn, not cars. Not a certain kind of car. And then he said, you call up about your American Express card. Someone's on the phone with a little bit of an accent. Where are you from? Oh, this is New Delhi. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And he says that sarcastically, as you know he can do. Why can't it be from Arizona, from New York, from Las Vegas, Nevada? That's where he was speaking. Why can't it be in this country? You would think it's impossible. How can it be from that far away and they save money? How could it be, right? They're from India. Well, here's the Economist response. It could be done here, but it would be much more expensive. And so if people on the phone in the United States, they wouldn't be doing the work they're doing. The prices paid to those people in India are well below the prices that we pay to U.S. workers, which is why U.S. workers wouldn't find it attractive to work in these jobs and instead work in jobs where they produce more value. So the overall value of output is higher because U.S. firms are finding people elsewhere who can do it for less, and U.S. workers are finding jobs for more. The minimum wage can mess that up, but even if there were no minimum wage, we would still be wanting to hire those people in India because they're so much less expensive. There was this table I used to show my students that I put together, showing what happened as we moved from having to have operators do long-distance phone calls to having that be automated. And looking at the number of workers you would have had to have, given the number of phone calls we made in the 90s, if you just had operators. And instead of having 0.25% of the labor force be operators, we'd have 3.5%. And you know what I titled that table? Why we have Starbucks. Like, where are Starbucks going to get their workers? From people who might have been telephone operators in a previous generation. There was this famous story, and it's still copyrighted, so I have to go by memory here. It was used in a lot of econ classes. It's a parable, it's not real, but it's great. There's this firm sets up on the coast of North Carolina, and it produces these goods really cheap, like TVs and cars and all these things, and they bring the prices down to American consumers. And they're big write-ups in Fortune and Forbes, and isn't this great? They're just so pro-consumer. And then one day, this 14-year-old kid is out in the ocean snorkeling, and he goes deep, and he finds that this firm is nothing but a gigantic import-export operation. That those cars and those TVs are coming in from Japan, and then they bring them up as if they produced them. And then they get denounced in the press. It didn't matter if it was technology, that was good. If it's trade, that's good. But people often think of it very different. Now, there was a famous economist in the late 19th century who actually ran for mayor of New York, either late 19th or early 20th century, named Henry George. And he was a really articulate pro-free trade guy. And here's what he said about protectionism, the term we use for applying big taxes to imports. Protectionism teaches us to do to ourselves in time of peace what enemies seek to do to us in time of war. When you think about the Civil War, what did the North try to do fairly successfully? Cut off access that the South had to various manufactured goods. Well, what does our government do in peacetime? Try to cut off or make more expensive our access to manufactured goods. And by the way, protectionism is incredibly expensive per job saved. Oh, and before I go to this next graph, I just want to point out, it doesn't even save jobs. It just saves jobs in the industry that's protected, but that means people move into that industry away from other industries. So there's no net increase in jobs, it's just a shift in jobs. This is from 1986, but it's adjusted to 2016 dollars. It gives the annual consumer losses per job saved in various industries. Benzenoid chemicals, over $2 million annually in consumer losses per job saved. Carbon steel, specialty steel, bolts, nuts, and large screws. And you can see these numbers in 2016 dollars are a multiple of what any given worker earns. I mean, a huge multiple in many cases. And by the way, one of the ways that we have done really well with free trade is on clothing. I sometimes can't find a kind of particular kind of clothing I want. In particular, I wanted a fairly sturdy thing that would be somewhat rain resistant and warm for our cold days, which we've had a fair number of. And I figured out when I retired, hey, you know what, I'm way wealthier than I thought. So now I'm willing to pay up to $200. And I went to Macy's and I went online, I couldn't find anything I liked. I went to Goodwill
I know.
on Lighthouse and paid $8 for this jacket I love. And what's that telling you? Not just that I'm cheap, but that's the kind of thing people get rid of because new clothing is so cheap. The world has really changed dramatically in that respect. Okay, now, here's the other interesting thing though, and it gets to kind of what was asked a minute ago. Trump is talking about tariffs on inputs to manufacturing. He wants more manufacturing jobs. Well, two big inputs to manufacturing are steel and aluminum. And the amount of aluminum in a car, an average car, is 362 pounds. The amount of aluminum in a light truck is 523 pounds. So it's going to make car and truck production more expensive. Now, there's this idea that we are deindustrializing. And here's why people think it. They look at the number of employees in manufacturing, and notice we start at 1940, it goes way up during the Second World War, goes down after the war, goes up during Korea, goes down, it hits its peak in 1980 at about 19 million people, and now it's down to about 13 million people. So if you just went with employees, you'd say, oh, we're deindustrializing. But that's input. What's output look like? Here's manufacturing sector in real terms. Notice that we went way up through the 90s. We dropped a little. Then we went way up through the first decade of this century. And why is that interesting? Because people talk about the so-called China shock, where they came in and they're manufacturing everything and we lose all this production. Well, guess what? We had our production go up during that little decade. It fell during the financial crisis, then it rose. It fell during the lockdowns and so on, and then it rose. And so we're roughly 7% below where we were in real manufacturing output at its peak. And its peak was earlier this century, not way back. And so what's really going on is huge productivity increases in manufacturing. And by the way, virtually every manufacturing country has the same story. China is losing manufacturing jobs because they're getting more productive. Now, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he said something last week that kind of shocked me. Low prices are not the essence of the American dream. Well, in a literal sense, that's true. I mean, the American dream is so much more complete than that. But aren't they part of it? Like, don't you want to be wealthier? And if prices go up and your wealth stays the same, aren't you poorer? So I think low prices are a piece of the American dream. And that made me nervous because he's kind of setting us up for accepting these higher prices that will come with protectionism. Now, to put it in perspective, we often hear that we're losing the middle class. And in a sense, it's true, but it's not true in the sense that people mean it. The middle class is shrinking. Unfortunately, this number goes up only to 2016, but it starts in 67. Household income from 35,000 to 100,000, the percent of households in that category. And this is all inflation adjusted. This is the same year dollars, 2016. And notice that the people in that first category, that fell to 42.1%. But now, look at households with incomes of 100,000 or more in 2016 dollars. It went from 8.1% in 1967 to more than 3 times that in 2016. And look at in households with less than 35,000. That went from 38.7% to 30.2%. So the middle class is disappearing upward. That's what's happening. Okay, now, what about the trade deficit? Back to trade. We do have a big trade deficit. We buy more imports than we sell exports. Now that narrows slightly when we include services. We export more services than we buy in imported services. So in 2023, the last year for which we have complete data, the balance on goods was minus $1 trillion. In other words, we bought $1 trillion more in goods than we sold. The balance on goods and services together was lower, $785 billion. Now, what's that mean? Well, if you have a current account deficit, which is what I just showed you, you must have a capital account surplus. It's a mathematical fact. If we're spending more on their stuff than they're spending on our stuff, what do they do with that money? Almost all of it comes back. They buy our bonds, typically federal government bonds. They buy land, they buy plants. Occasionally they even invest in a plant. And so it does come back. We just get more investment, which makes, when Trump says he's very upset about the current account deficit, and he's very happy when foreigners invest, well, which is it? The more they invest, the bigger our current account deficit will be. They're just mathematically offsetting. Now, there's one other way it can show up, and that is they hold on to dollars. What a deal that is for us. The federal government can print a $100 bill for just shy of 10 cents. So they spend $100 and get $100 worth of stuff, and it costs 10 cents. It reminds me of that old Jay Leno ad from the 80s for Doritos. Keep eating them, we'll make more. We can easily print more $100 bills. Okay, so that's trade, balance of payments, deficits, and so on. Now I want to turn to tax policy. So Trump's goal is to keep the 2017 tax cuts, and then on top of it, no tax on tips and no tax on Social Security benefits. And the latest we heard from the Commerce Secretary, no one with $150,000 in annual income pays taxes. I mean, they would miss out on approximately $500 billion a year in tax revenue. I don't know what to do with that. Like, we're already dealing with this huge, huge deficit. But let me say more about the other things. The tax on tips is a relatively small revenue loser for the feds. However, never underestimate the ability of people to game the system. So I sometimes hire research assistants. And if I pay them $600 or more in a year, I've got to file a 1099, and that is expensive. My accountant charges me $150. So what I will do if I hire someone over a year is pay like $560, and then $240 the next year if he's willing to wait. And then I don't have to send him a 1099. And what he does is his business, not mine. But what if I could say, I'm spending $800 on this guy, I'm paying him $560, and I'm going to give him a $240 tip. I don't have to declare anything. So I could imagine people doing more of that, and I don't know how to estimate that. The tax on Social Security benefits, when that was put in as a result of the 1983 Greenspan Commission on Social Security, the idea was to have implicitly means testing. The higher your income, the bigger a percent of your Social Security that gets taxed. And those tax revenues are dedicated to the Social Security Trust Fund. So if you got rid of that, our big crunch with Social Security probably wouldn't happen in 2033. It'd probably happen in like 2031. I just think it's implausible. Actually, I do think it's a good idea to keep the 2017 tax cuts. And I just want to show you, to put it in perspective, because we often hear the rich made out, the high income people made out. Well, of course they did. They were paying most of the taxes. So a more reasonable way to judge what people got is to look at the percent change in taxes. And so if you look at all federal taxes as a percent of income, because that includes Social Security and Medicare, the lowest quintile the lowest fifth got a 7.3% reduction, the second got 10.3%, the top got 6.7%, the top 1% got 4.6%, so they got less of a percentage tax cut. On income, notice that the middle got the biggest percentage cut, and then it went down. Notice it says NA, not applicable for the first two quintiles, because they weren't paying income tax. And then another way to do it is to show the average tax rate, income tax rate. So the bottom 50% went down from 4 to 3.4, which is a 15% drop, and so on. And you get roughly the same percent drops, except the drop for the top 1% is a little lower as a percent. So that just kind of puts it in perspective. Now, here's the problem with high marginal tax rates. I came across this article by a Stanford professor that I should have known about way earlier. It came out in 2019. He says, this paper considers the taxation of top incomes when the following conditions apply. New ideas drive economic growth. The reward for creating successful innovation is a top income. And innovation cannot be perfectly targeted by a separate research subsidy. Government isn't good at figuring out who to give subsidies to. He says, think about the business methods of Walmart. Who would have thought to subsidize them coming up with that whole thing? The creation of Uber, government tried to stop it. Or the idea of Amazon.com. These conditions lead to a new force affecting the optimal top tax rate. By slowing the creation of the new ideas that drive aggregate GDP, top income taxation reduces everyone's income, not just the income at the top. So if I had to say which parts of the 2017 tax law we should keep, it'd be the cuts for the top people, but I'd be like Mr. Unpopular, right? So everyone's supposed to get some. So the bottom line here is if Trump gets his way in his major tax cuts, but not on the $150,000 cutoff, the deficit will grow and so will debt. That's just a fact. Okay, so now I want to turn to immigration. Trump is cracking down on two kinds of immigration: illegal immigration and legal immigration. The thing that's getting a lot of publicity, of course, is illegal immigration. And here's where I told Michelle, I had to do a lot of research in the last few days. I can't keep up with him. I can't keep up with either the illegal or the legal part. So I'm going to just give snapshots of things I do know about. But I also want to give the setting, because remember I said about how economists don't agree on much? One of the other things economists agree on is that immigration is good, that we're better off with more immigration. Now, a lot of them want limits on that, but the limits the typical economist wants for the United States are higher than what we have. We typically have 1 million, roughly, legal immigrants come in every year. Biden got it up to like 1.2, 1.3. Trump wants it to go under 1 million. So he's moving the opposite direction. And here's how this one economist put it. This is the title of an article he wrote: $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. There's this old joke about economists. Two economists walk along, one sees a $100 bill on the sidewalk and says, "There's a $100 bill," and the other economist says, "Couldn't be, someone would have picked it up." Well, there are $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. In other words, if we allowed much more immigration, our GDP would increase by trillions. So here are some estimates. These numbers on the left are all as a percent, it's the percent increase in world GDP. And you notice that this is, by the way, that one Hamilton and Wally, that's if like everyone earning less moved to where they could earn more. We would have a population of like somewhere between 500 million and 1 trillion. So that's kind of extreme, but anyway, the point is we would have a much higher GDP. And so would Japan, so would Canada, so would Britain, so would Germany, and so on. Because they'd move from where they're making whatever they're making to where immediately their productivity is 5 to 15 times what it was with no increased training, just because they're more productive. And this one economist put it for people that wonder, how could that be? Imagine you were a farmer and you moved from the Antarctic to the prairies of Manitoba. You would be way more productive. You can't do much farming in the Antarctic. So that's kind of the equivalent of what they're doing. So this economist who said that, his name's Brian Kaplan, and here's something he laid out to give you an idea of how productive migration can be. Migration within China. Remember Mao and all those horrible people not only killed people, they prevented them from moving. So you had a limit on who could move to a city. And then Deng Xiaoping and so on started getting rid of those restrictions. So in 1976, China's whole GDP in 2014 dollars was $500 billion, and it was $500 per person. In 2014, and this is in the same year dollars, 10 trillion. It 20-tupled. And GDP per person, 7,000, so it roughly 13-tupled. That's incredible. That just gives you an idea of how productive migration can be. Now, we're way more modest than that, but here's what the CBO said in a study last year. The increase in immigration, this was under Biden, boosts federal revenues as well as mandatory spending and interest on the debt in CBO's baseline projections, lowering deficits on net by 0.9 trillion over a 10-year period. So in other words, it's increasing the revenues more than it's increasing spending. Their estimates of what the net present value is. Look at the stream of taxes immigrants are paying minus the benefits received. Existing immigrants, people like me, 58,000. New immigrants, 250,000. People with high school degrees, 49,000. People with non-high school degrees, we're losing on them. Young people with high school degrees, 239, and young with non-high school degrees, 35K. Older people, we're losing whether high school degrees or not, because they're getting Social Security and Medicare. And what that shows, basically, when people talk about welfare in the United States, what they don't seem to realize is the welfare state in the United States is aimed mainly at people in this room. Those are the big numbers, Social Security, Medicare, and so on. When people come and apply for asylum, there's a 180-day no-work rule. And that's, by the way, why those budgets in Chicago and New York were going crazy, because they couldn't work and make money, so the government subsidized them. But Biden had an exception after the Ukraine war started, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He would allow 30,000 Ukrainians per month to come in and work right away. And you've got a huge number of Ukrainians in the Chicago area, and no one's complaining about them. They're working, not causing problems. And then he applied it to people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, 30,000 per month, the total from those places. And now, well, what about taking our jobs? There's an unlimited amount of work to be done. If you doubt that, I've got a lawn for you to mow. To see what happened with our big increase in the labor force. Think of the entry of women into the labor force here. 1950, 43.8 million men, 2000, 75.2 million. Women, 18.4 million, and more than 3 times that in 2000. But look at the unemployment rate. For men, it went down. For women, it went down. There's an infinite amount of work to be done. And that'll be true with immigrants too. Okay, now, what about they'll cut our wages? So, remember I showed you my encyclopedia. I wanted that encyclopedia of economics to represent kind of the mainstream, not just my view. And so the guy I got in immigration, I didn't know a lot about his work, but I knew he was one of the major players in immigration, a Harvard economist named George Borjas. Ironically, the two of them together make it ironic. His parents brought him over from Cuba when he was young, and he's kind of anti-immigration. So here's the major kind of mainstream anti-immigration economist, and here's what he finds. That between 1980 and 2000, Mexican immigration reduced overall wages of natives, that's people already here, by 3.4% in the short run and 0% in the long run. Those are not annual effects, they're the total effect. Dropouts suffered more, but the effect is surprisingly mild. 8.2% in the short run, 4.8% in the long run. They also report that moderately educated natives, high school graduates without college degrees, enjoy long-run gains. But immigrants and domestics, us, are not perfect substitutes. Perry and Sparber showed that due to the limited knowledge of language immigrants have, they have a comparative advantage in manual types of jobs. And so people who know the language tend to go to a higher level thing, like managing the people who don't. They say this dynamic specialization in tasks pushes natives to upgrade their jobs as communication-intensive occupations pay better than manual-intensive ones, and protects their wages from competition with immigrants. So, Biden got a lot of pressure. He's feeling a lot of pressure. He wanted to help Kamala Harris. Here was what he had done up till August. 530,000 migrants from those 4 countries, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, flown into the US. They were here legally under this special immigration law known as parole. So they were here legally, which sometimes doesn't get reported. But he ended the program. So roughly 214, this adds up, 214,000 Haitians and so on. The first group set to start losing their parole status this month in October are Venezuelans. The parole periods of Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans won't start to expire until early next year. So that was in the law before Trump even came in. So Biden was moving in a Trump direction, essentially. Okay, so now I want to talk about Doge. Okay. And again, I had to learn a lot in a short amount of time, and so my knowledge is imperfect. And I have no dog in the house. Okay. So here's the problem I noticed when I started digging into it. There's bad reporting on what it is, who does what, by both Trump and his opponents, the press that's hostile to him. They both talk about what Elon Musk is doing, like he is firing these people, he's ending this spending. No, he's not. He and his workers are finding data and making recommendations, and Trump is taking those recommendations seriously, as are the heads of various cabinets. Now, sometimes, according to that, I heard about this little fight between Musk and Rubio. Sometimes it looks as if Musk is doing it, but someone actually in that agency had to be doing it because he doesn't have the power to do it. What he has the power to do is find data, propose things to Trump, and then monitor to make sure they're being done. That's what he's doing, okay? Now, he looks at spending, and he proposes cuts in spending by cutting back things like grants and firing government workers. Now, one of the things that the Trump administration has really publicized is all these crazy expenditures under US aid, like helping, frogs become bisexual or, those kinds of things. I'm making that up, but some of it's pretty crazy. Those are small numbers, and USAID spends $45 billion a year. So the argument that other people have made back is, yeah, but that's rounding error, which is roughly correct. Look at what the main thing they do is, which is foreign aid, which is also, that is a true statement. But now, let's look at foreign aid. The Economist, I'm going to show this in The Economist, that they hate Trump. I mean, they hate him. And that's what makes what they wrote in the March 6th issue so interesting. I titled it Foreign Aid is a Failure. Rich countries spent $256 billion, or 0.4% of their combined GDP, on foreign aid last year, enough to provide sub-Saharan African governments with a sum as large as their total tax revenues. The average Malawian has had more money spent on them by international agencies than by their own government every year since the country gained independence from Britain in 1964. And the article is titled, "Aid Cannot Make Poor Countries Rich." But that's an understatement. Aid can't make poor countries much less poor. It just has not worked. Government is not good at this. They hand money to governments there that sometimes ends up in Swiss bank accounts, or just pays roads to where the Swiss head of government has his villa, stuff like that. It's just, it's a huge waste. Now, I do think there's this major thing that Doge misses, and that is the role of regulation. So, consider the Environmental Protection Agency or the Securities and Exchange Commission and compare those to the National Park Service. Who here saw CBS Sunday Morning Sunday? And they looked at the Park Service and losing people, right? By the way, I checked those numbers because I wondered, they never gave a number as far as I remember. They've lost roughly 5% of their employees. Is that substantial? Yes. Is it huge? I don't think so. But anyway, 5%. But here's the difference. You can have an employee at the Securities and Exchange Commission come up with a regulation, which they love to do, that costs the economy $1 billion. And that's one employee. So if you cut that employee and he doesn't have time to do that regulation, you've done a mitzvah, right? You've done a real service. And I'm not just making that up. My friend and co-author Charlie and I developed our own press, the Chicago Park Press, to produce this book. And we were told that by sometime in December, we had to file this thing with the SEC, including a picture of our driver's license, because of some little rule they came up with. And then someone went to court and they got it postponed, and finally the Treasury announced, you know what, we're not going to penalize you. So every week I checked to make sure I wasn't good. And they were going to penalize us $500 a day for not complying. Now, why do I not want to have them have my driver's license? Well, DMV has it, but I know government, and I know they get hacked, and someone else can come up with it. I was a federal employee, and we were hacked on some kind of form we had to fill out every 7 years, and so they could know all these things about my personal life that I had to put in there. Now, a driver's license isn't quite the same, but still, they can get hacked. So that's this huge cost imposed on us for very little reason, I think. And they've narrowed it down to, well, what were we worried about? Foreigners. Okay, I don't like that either, but they now are doing it on foreigners, not just on people in general. So there's a regulation that if you kind of manage to fire that guy, you'd have a big saving to the economy. National Park Service, you fire that person and you just get a little less good of a park, right? So that's not a big benefit of that. Now, here's the interesting thing about spending. Chris Edwards, this economist at the Cato Institute, pointed out, see, in the businesses that Elon Musk is in, compensation of employees is a huge percent of costs. A typical number is 40%. In the federal government, compensation of workers is 8%. 8. Think of what the government does. How many government employees does it take to give out $1 trillion in Social Security benefits? Maybe 10,000, but not 1 million. And so Elon Musk is clearly a smarter person than I am. But I don't think he's a more informed person than I am. I don't think he understands that. One of the things that I didn't get into directly, but I just want to talk about for a minute, is the idea of giving government officials discretionary power. And I think one of the beauties of this country, and as many of you know, I moved here from Canada, is this thing, the Constitution. And it's a very clever way. It's not just the Bill of Rights. It's all through the thing, dividing powers and having this person can't do more than this without that kind of group's permission and that kind of thing. And I think what we've seen over the years with the president is that breaking down. It's not just Trump. It was Bush, it was Obama, it was Biden, and we're getting kind of an imperial presidency. And I want to and we could talk about all kinds of things in immigration, but I don't want to go there because I don't know enough, but I do know tariffs. And in the Constitution, the only organization that gets to impose tariffs is Congress. So how does Trump get to do it? Well, Congress gave up its power some years ago. Under certain kinds of emergencies, the president can impose tariffs, and those are fairly ill-defined. And he's taken that to the limit, and some might say beyond. And this spending bill, the continuing resolution that got passed last week, had a provision in it saying we can't even challenge him on whether it's a real emergency. One reason I don't buy that it's about fentanyl and illegal immigration, he says the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. And I think whatever you think of his sincerity, I think the most sincerely held view he has is that tariffs are good. I really do. I have a little bit of hope. I'm a glass half full kind of person. that because Congress has that power, Congress can't change the Constitution on its own. If you know anything about the Constitution, you know, Congress has to get a certain percent voting for it, and they gotta get the states to ratify it, all that stuff. So Congress can't actually give up its power over tariffs, even though it has done so, because that would be unilaterally changing the Constitution. And I think if these tariffs remain, here's my little hope, there's gonna be some major importer that's gonna sue. Say, wait a minute, Congress can't do that. What will the Supreme Court do about it? I don't know. Anyway, that's kind of, as you can see, there's stuff I didn't talk about, but I try to cover the landscape of economic policy. And there'll be lots of things happening that I don't anticipate. Things are moving quickly.
Thank you.